Most people will watch this video and stay exactly the same. Not because they didn't understand it, not because they're not capable, but because a part of them is still protecting the version of themselves that feels safe. And that's the part no one talks about. You don't stay average because life is too hard. You stay average because your mind has learned to choose comfort over truth, familiarity over growth, and reaction over control. You wake up, you go through your routine, you deal with people, situations, emotions, and without even noticing it, you keep repeating the same patterns that keep you exactly where you are. But what if the real problem isn't your circumstances? It's the way you've been trained to respond to them. Because long before modern self-help tried to fix surface-level habits, Stoic thinkers were already studying something deeper. Marcus Aurelius didn't try to improve his life by chasing better conditions. He trained his mind to become untouchable by them, and that changes everything, because when your mind is steady, the chaos outside loses its power over you. When your reactions are controlled, nothing can easily move you. And when you stop living on autopilot, you stop being predictable, and you start becoming intentional. If these conversations speak to something real in you, something grounded in truth, philosophy, and inner growth, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us reach more minds like yours. And it quietly signals that you're walking this path with intention. Most people will watch this video and stay exactly the same, not because they lack intelligence or potential, and not because they are unwilling to grow, but because there is a quiet, deeply rooted part of them that resists letting go of the version of themselves that feels familiar, predictable, and safe, even when that version is the very thing holding them back from becoming something more grounded, more disciplined, and more intentional in the way they live and think. You may recognize this in yourself if you pause long enough to notice it, because it shows up in subtle ways, in the habits you repeat without questioning, in the reactions that feel automatic, in the thoughts that return again and again as if they are part of your identity, rather than patterns that have simply been reinforced over time. The challenge is that most people never question this process deeply enough, because they have been taught to approach change from the surface rather than from the structure underneath it. And so they try to improve by adding more effort, more motivation, more discipline on top of the same foundation, without realizing that if the foundation itself remains unchanged, everything built on it will continue to lead to the same outcomes. This is why progress often feels temporary, because it is not rooted in a shift of perspective, but in a temporary increase of effort, and effort without clarity eventually fades, returning you to the same patterns you thought you had moved beyond. The Stoic thinkers approached this in a way that was far more precise and far more demanding, because they were not interested in superficial change or short-term motivation, but in building a mind that could remain stable regardless of circumstances. And that kind of stability does not come from adjusting your habits alone, but from understanding the way your thoughts shape your experience of reality. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his time writing to himself, not to inspire or entertain, but to remind himself of truths that are easy to forget in moments of pressure. And what he was doing was not self-expression, but self-correction, constantly bringing his thinking back to a place of clarity where he could act with intention rather than reaction. If you begin to observe your own life with that same level of attention, you will notice that much of what you experience is not determined by events themselves, but by the meaning you assign to those events. And that meaning is often created so quickly that it feels inseparable from reality, even though it is not. When something happens, your mind does not wait. It interprets, it evaluates, it categorizes, and within seconds, you are not just experiencing the event, you are experiencing your interpretation of it, and that interpretation carries emotional weight that influences your behavior in ways that feel natural but are actually conditioned responses. Epictetus captured this idea with remarkable simplicity when he said that it is not what happens to you that disturbs you, but your judgment about it. And if you sit with that idea long enough, you begin to realize that it changes everything about how you understand your own reactions. It means that what feels like an external problem is often an internal construction. And once you see that clearly, you begin to recognize that your reactions are not fixed but learned, and anything that is learned can be questioned and gradually reshaped. This is where the process becomes both challenging and powerful, because noticing the pattern is only the beginning, and the real work begins when you start interrupting it in real time, not after the moment has passed, not in reflection, but in the exact moment when the reaction begins to form. There is always a small gap, even if it is brief, between the trigger and the response. And within that gap, there is a choice, a quiet opportunity to either continue the pattern or step outside of it. And at first, that choice feels difficult because the pattern is familiar and the alternative feels uncertain. Carl Jung spoke about this kind of internal awareness when he said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And what he was pointing to is the fact that most people are not consciously choosing their responses. They are following patterns that have been built over time, patterns shaped by past experiences, repeated thoughts, and unexamined beliefs that continue to influence behavior without being questioned. When you begin to bring awareness to those patterns, you disrupt their automatic nature. And even though that disruption may feel uncomfortable at first, it is the beginning of genuine change. As you continue to observe yourself more closely, you start to notice how often your behavior is influenced by external expectations, how easily you adjust your tone, your words, and your reactions based on how you think others will respond. And over time, this creates a version of you that is not entirely chosen, but partially shaped by the environment you move through. This does not mean that you are being inauthentic in a deliberate way, but that you are adapting in ways that become so consistent that they begin to feel like your natural identity, even when they limit your ability to act freely. The Stoic perspective challenges this by shifting the focus away from how you are perceived and toward how you choose to act, regardless of perception. And this shift is subtle but significant because it removes the constant pressure to manage how others see you and replaces it with a commitment to align your actions with your own principles. When you begin to act from that place, you become less predictable, not in a chaotic sense, but in a way that reflects intention rather than habit. And this changes the dynamic of your interactions in ways that are not immediately obvious, but become clear over time. People respond to patterns, and when your behavior follows a consistent pattern, others learn how to engage with you based on that consistency. But when you begin to act with awareness instead of repetition, those patterns become less reliable, and the interactions that once felt automatic begin to shift. This does not mean that you are trying to control others, but that you are no longer allowing your behavior to be shaped entirely by expectation, and that creates a different kind of presence, one that is grounded and steady rather than reactive. At the same time, you begin to see more clearly how much of your internal tension has been tied to outcomes that you cannot control, and how often your sense of stability has depended on things unfolding in a certain way, whether it is how people respond to you, how situations develop, or how plans turn out. The Stoics addressed this directly by emphasizing the importance of focusing only on what is within your control and releasing attachment to everything else, not as a form of detachment from life, but as a way of preserving your internal balance regardless of external conditions. When you apply this consistently, you notice a shift in how you experience uncertainty, because instead of trying to manage every possible outcome, you focus on your actions, your effort, and your decisions. And this creates a sense of clarity that reduces the mental noise that comes from overthinking situations that are beyond your influence. This does not eliminate challenges, but it changes how you move through them, allowing you to remain composed even when things do not go as expected. Over time, this way of thinking begins to reshape your identity in a way that is not forced or dramatic, but gradual and stable, because it is built on repeated choices that align with awareness rather than impulse. You begin to trust your ability to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically, and that trust becomes the foundation for a different kind of confidence, one that does not depend on external validation, but on internal consistency. This is where the idea of destroying your average life takes on a deeper meaning, because it is not about rejecting everything you have been or creating a completely new persona, but about removing the patterns that keep you operating at a level that is below your potential and replacing them with a way of thinking that is more aligned with clarity, discipline, and intentional action. It is about recognizing that the average version of your life is not defined by your circumstances, but by the patterns you continue to repeat without questioning. And as you continue this process, you begin to notice that the changes extend beyond individual moments and start to influence the overall direction of your life, because the way you think determines the way you act, and the way you act determines the results you experience over time. When your thinking becomes more precise, your actions become more effective, and your results begin to reflect that shift in a way that feels natural rather than forced. You may still encounter moments where old patterns try to reassert themselves, where reactions feel immediate and familiar, but the difference now is that you are aware of them, and that awareness gives you the ability to choose differently, even if the choice is not always perfect. The goal is not perfection, but consistency in returning to awareness, because it is through that consistency that real transformation takes place. And eventually you reach a point where the distance between stimulus and response becomes more stable, where you no longer feel pulled into every reaction, where you can observe situations without being overwhelmed by them, and where your sense of self is no longer tied to external validation or unpredictable outcomes. At that point, you are no longer operating from the same foundation that kept you average, because you have replaced it with something stronger, something more stable, and something that allows you to move through life with a level of clarity that most people never develop. So when you find yourself in a moment where the familiar reaction begins to rise, take a step back, even if it is brief, and remind yourself that you are not required to follow it, that you have the ability to observe, to choose, and to act in a way that reflects the person you are becoming rather than the patterns you have repeated in the past. Because it is in those small moments, repeated over time, that the structure of your life begins to change in a way that is both subtle and powerful. And that is where the real transformation happens, not in sudden breakthroughs, but in the steady, deliberate process of becoming someone who is no longer controlled by patterns, but guided by awareness. And as this awareness continues to deepen, something even more subtle begins to unfold within you, something that is not immediately visible on the surface, but gradually reshapes the way you experience every interaction, every decision, and every moment that once felt overwhelming or difficult to navigate. You begin to notice that the intensity you once felt in certain situations starts to soften, not because the situations themselves have changed, but because your relationship to them has shifted in a way that gives you more space, more clarity, and more control over how you engage with what is happening around you. At first, this change may feel almost unfamiliar, because you have spent so much time identifying with your reactions that stepping outside of them can feel like losing a part of yourself. But what you are actually losing is not something essential, but something conditioned, something that was built through repetition rather than intention. And when you begin to see that clearly, you realize that much of what you once considered to be your personality was actually a collection of responses shaped by past experiences, reinforced over time until they became automatic. This realization is not meant to disconnect you from who you are, but to bring you closer to a version of yourself that is less influenced by unconscious patterns and more aligned with conscious choice. Carl Jung spoke about this process as a form of individuation, where a person gradually becomes aware of the forces shaping their behavior and begins to integrate them in a way that leads to a more complete and stable sense of self. This is not something that happens quickly, and it is not something that can be forced, but it begins with a willingness to observe without immediately reacting, to understand without immediately judging, and to create space where there was once only impulse. As you continue to practice this, you start to notice that your thoughts themselves begin to change. Not in a dramatic or sudden way, but in a gradual shift towards simplicity and clarity. You begin to question the narratives that once felt unquestionable, and you start to see how often your mind has been creating unnecessary complexity around situations that are, in reality, much simpler than they appear. This simplification does not reduce your understanding but enhances it, because it allows you to focus on what is actually happening rather than what your mind is projecting onto it. In this state, your attention becomes more focused and your energy becomes more intentional, because you are no longer spreading it across countless unnecessary thoughts and reactions. You begin to conserve your energy in a way that feels natural, directing it toward actions that align with your values rather than reactions that drain your stability. This shift is subtle, but it has a powerful effect on how you move through your day, because it reduces the internal noise that often makes even simple situations feel overwhelming. At the same time, your perception of others begins to change as well, because as you become more aware of your own patterns, you begin to recognize similar patterns in those around you. You start to see how people react, not always based on the present moment, but based on their own internal states, their own expectations, and their own unresolved tensions. This does not lead to judgment, but to understanding, because you realize that just as you have been influenced by patterns you were not always aware of, others are moving through their own patterns as well. This understanding creates a kind of distance that is not cold or detached, but grounded and balanced, allowing you to engage with others without becoming entangled in their reactions. You begin to listen more carefully, not just to what is being said, but to what is driving it. And this deeper level of awareness allows you to respond in a way that is more aligned with reality rather than assumption. You are no longer reacting to surface-level behavior, but to the underlying dynamics that shape it, and this gives you a level of clarity that most interactions lack. As this clarity develops, you also begin to refine your sense of boundaries, not in a rigid or defensive way, but in a way that reflects a deeper understanding of where your responsibility begins and ends. You recognize that you are responsible for your actions, your choices, and your responses, but not for the emotions, expectations, or reactions of others. This distinction becomes increasingly important because it allows you to engage without taking on what does not belong to you and to step back when necessary without feeling the need to justify that decision. This ability to step back is often misunderstood because it can be mistaken for avoidance or indifference, but in reality, it is a form of discipline, a conscious choice to preserve your stability rather than sacrifice it in situations that do not require your full engagement. The Stoics practiced this kind of discipline not as a way of withdrawing from life, but as a way of engaging with it more effectively by focusing their energy where it could have the most meaningful impact. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that he had the power to keep his mind free from disturbance, and that this power was not dependent on external conditions, but on his own ability to maintain clarity in the face of them. This idea may seem simple, but when applied consistently, it becomes transformative because it shifts the source of your stability from something external to something internal, from something uncertain to something you can develop and strengthen over time. As you continue along this path, you begin to notice that your sense of time changes as well, because you are no longer lost in constant reaction or mental repetition. You become more present, more aware of the moment you are in, and more capable of directing your attention where it is needed rather than where it is pulled. This presence creates a sense of calm that is not dependent on the absence of difficulty, but on your ability to remain grounded within it. And within that calm, your decisions begin to carry more weight because they are no longer made impulsively or out of habit, but with consideration and awareness. You start to see the long-term impact of your choices more clearly, and this perspective allows you to act in a way that is not only effective in the moment, but aligned with where you want to go. You are no longer reacting to immediate pressure, but responding with a sense of direction that extends beyond the present situation. This is where the deeper transformation begins to take hold, because your life is no longer shaped primarily by external events, but by the way you choose to engage with them. The patterns that once defined your experience begin to lose their influence, and in their place, a new structure emerges, one that is built on awareness, discipline, and intentional action. This structure is not rigid but adaptable, allowing you to navigate change without losing your sense of balance. And as this becomes more consistent, you begin to understand that the idea of destroying your average life is not about dramatic change or visible transformation, but about a fundamental shift in how you think, how you respond, and how you move through the world. It is about removing the automatic patterns that kept you operating at a certain level and replacing them with a way of being that is more aligned with clarity and control. This does not mean that life becomes easy or that challenges disappear, but that your ability to handle them becomes stronger, more stable, and more grounded. You are no longer overwhelmed by every difficulty because you have developed the capacity to remain centered even when things are uncertain. You are no longer dependent on constant validation because you have built a sense of self that is not easily shaken by external opinions. And in that state, something becomes clear that may not have been obvious before, which is that the power you were searching for was never in controlling everything around you, but in understanding and guiding what happens within you. It is in the ability to observe without being consumed, to respond without being driven by impulse, and to act in a way that reflects your values rather than your habits. So as you continue to move forward, carry this awareness with you, not as something rigid or fixed, but as something you return to again and again, especially in moments where it is most difficult to maintain. Because it is in those moments when the pressure is highest and the patterns are strongest that your choices carry the most weight and your growth becomes most visible. And over time, as these choices accumulate, they create a life that is no longer defined by repetition, but by intention, a life where you are not simply reacting to what happens, but actively shaping your experience through the clarity and discipline you have developed within yourself. And that is where the true meaning of transformation reveals itself, not as something distant or unattainable, but as something that is built gradually, moment by moment, through the way you choose to think, to act, and to be. And as this process continues to unfold, there comes a point where you begin to notice something even more refined taking shape within you. Something that is not just about controlling reactions or observing patterns, but about developing a kind of inner stability that no longer depends on constant effort to maintain. In the beginning, awareness requires attention. It requires discipline. It requires you to consciously step back from reactions that once felt automatic, but over time, as these choices become more consistent, they begin to form a new baseline, a way of being that feels natural rather than forced. This is where the practice begins to shift from effort to embodiment, where you are no longer reminding yourself constantly to pause, to observe, to respond differently, but you simply find yourself doing so without the same level of internal resistance. The patterns that once dominated your behavior begin to lose their strength, not because you are fighting them, but because you are no longer feeding them with the same automatic responses. And in their absence, something quieter but more powerful takes their place, a steady awareness that allows you to remain grounded even when situations become complex or unpredictable. At the same time, your relationship with discomfort begins to change in a way that is subtle but significant. Because instead of seeing discomfort as something to avoid or escape, you begin to recognize it as a natural part of growth, something that signals the edge of your current understanding rather than a threat to your stability. This shift is important because much of the average life is built around avoiding discomfort, choosing what feels easy, familiar, and safe, even when those choices limit long-term progress. But when you begin to accept discomfort as part of the process, you remove one of the main forces that keeps you in place because you are no longer making decisions based solely on immediate relief. You start to act based on what aligns with your values, even when it requires effort, patience, or uncertainty. And this is where discipline becomes less about forcing yourself to act and more about aligning yourself with a direction that feels meaningful, even when it is not immediately comfortable. This perspective was central to Stoic thought, where the goal was not to eliminate difficulty, but to develop the strength to move through it with clarity and purpose. Epictetus emphasized that challenges are not obstacles to be avoided, but opportunities to practice virtue, to refine your character, and to strengthen your ability to remain steady in the face of change. When you begin to apply this idea consistently, you start to see difficulties not as interruptions, but as part of the structure that shapes your growth. As your mindset shifts in this way, you also begin to notice that your sense of urgency becomes more focused and less reactive, because you are no longer rushing to escape discomfort or fix every situation immediately. Instead, you develop a kind of patience that allows you to move deliberately, to think clearly before acting, and to recognize that not every situation requires an immediate response. This patience is not passive, but active, grounded in the understanding that clarity often leads to better decisions than speed. In this state, your actions become more intentional, not because you are overthinking every step, but because you have reduced the internal noise that once clouded your judgment. You are no longer reacting to every thought or emotion as if it demands action, and this creates a space where your decisions can be guided by awareness rather than impulse. This is where your behavior begins to reflect a deeper level of control, not the kind that forces outcomes, but the kind that maintains alignment regardless of outcomes. At the same time, your perspective on success begins to evolve, because you are no longer measuring it solely by external results, but by the consistency of your actions and the clarity of your thinking. You begin to understand that real progress is not always visible in immediate outcomes, but in the way you handle situations, in the stability you maintain, and in the discipline you apply even when there is no immediate reward. This shift allows you to stay committed to your path without becoming discouraged by temporary setbacks or fluctuations in results. Carl Jung spoke about the importance of integrating different aspects of the self, of becoming whole rather than fragmented, and in many ways this process reflects that idea, because as you become more aware of your patterns and more intentional in your responses, you begin to align your thoughts, actions, and values in a way that reduces internal conflict. You are no longer divided between what you know and what you do, between what you want and how you act. And this alignment creates a sense of stability that is both grounding and empowering. As this alignment strengthens, you also begin to notice that your need for external validation continues to diminish, not because you no longer value connection or feedback, but because your sense of worth is no longer dependent on it. You are able to listen, to learn, and to adjust without losing your sense of direction, and this allows you to engage with others more authentically, without the underlying pressure to be constantly approved or understood. This authenticity changes the quality of your interactions because you are no longer performing or adapting unconsciously, but expressing yourself with clarity and intention. You are more present, more attentive, and more capable of engaging without being pulled into unnecessary reactions. This does not make every interaction easy, but it makes your approach to them more consistent, more grounded, and more aligned with who you are becoming. And as all of these changes begin to integrate, you reach a point where the difference between your previous way of living and your current way becomes clear, not in a dramatic or external sense, but in the way you experience your own mind. The constant tension, the repeated patterns, the automatic reactions that once defined your daily life begin to fade, replaced by a sense of steadiness that allows you to navigate situations with greater ease and clarity. This is not the result of a single realization or a sudden transformation, but of a continuous process of awareness, reflection, and intentional action that gradually reshapes the structure of your thinking. It is built in moments that most people overlook, in the quiet decisions that do not seem significant at the time, but accumulate into something meaningful over time. And as this process continues, you begin to understand that the idea of destroying your average life is not about rejecting your past or forcing change, but about outgrowing the patterns that once defined you, about stepping into a way of being that is more aligned with clarity, discipline, and intentional living. It is about recognizing that the life you experience is shaped not just by what happens, but by how you think, how you respond, and how you choose to engage with the world around you. So as you move forward, continue to return to this awareness, especially in moments where it feels most challenging, because it is in those moments that your choices carry the greatest weight and your growth becomes most visible. Continue to observe, to question, and to act with intention, not because it is always easy, but because it leads you toward a version of yourself that is no longer limited by unconscious patterns, but guided by conscious understanding. And over time, as these choices become more consistent, you will begin to see that the life you are creating is no longer average, not because it is extraordinary in appearance, but because it is grounded in a level of clarity and control that allows you to move through the world with purpose, stability, and a quiet strength that does not need to be proven, but is simply lived. At some point, without even realizing exactly when it happened, you will notice that the things that once controlled you no longer have the same hold, that the reactions that once felt automatic now feel optional, and that the version of you who lived on autopilot has quietly been replaced by someone more aware, more steady, and more in control of how they move through life. That is the shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. So don't rush this process. Stay with it, return to it, build it moment by moment, choice by choice, until it becomes part of who you are. And if this spoke to something deeper in you, then don't stop here. There's another video on the screen that will take you even further into mastering your mind and strengthening this way of thinking. Watch it and keep building that version of yourself most people never reach. And truly, thank you for being here and for being a part of Mind.